Okay, so it's my very great pleasure to introduce Clare Thomson, who's an old friend of mine and has written this report recently for the Institute of Physics. Clare has been a secondary school teacher of physics for many years, but more recently, for 8 years, worked at the Institute of Physics in their education department, where she's had a particular brief for approaching gender issues in education. Well, I think it was a broader brief, diversity and inclusion, but with a particular focus on gender in recent times. So this particular report that she's got copies of, this work was funded by the Government Equalities Office together with the Institute of Physics, and she's going to speak to this report today. So thanks for joining us, Clare.
Thank you, thank you. It's really lovely to be here, and a nice change from retirement. I actually retired sometime in 2015, so it's nice to come back and have a bit of, you know, interest and excitement back in my life again, rather than the unbridled leisure time I had elsewhere. But so what I'm going to do is, as Joe said, this project, I wasn't actually involved in writing the final report, but I was involved in all the work that went into it, and that was aimed at investigating and addressing gender stereotyping in secondary schools, and resulted in a good practice guide, which I've got some copies of here, but you can get online as well. And it presents suggestions for schools facing similar barriers, and sort of highlights what we see are 9 essential features of schools that are doing well in this area. So I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of a background, particularly from the Institute of Physics perspective, because I think it's not uninteresting to find out why we ended up doing this work, and then give you more details of the project, and then there will be some time for discussion at the end. Okay, so starting off with, if we look at A-level entries over the last 25 years or so, these are the entries for girls into STEM subjects. So the blue line at the bottom is physics. This line is chemistry. This is maths and further maths. And the pale blue line, which you may be hard to see, is biology. And they've all gone up over since the year 2000, but physics has gone up more slowly than the others. And the other thing, of course, to note is that during that time, the proportion of girls who take physics has stayed around 20%, so more than 25 years worth of time. And despite all the interventions that have happened in schools and the huge changes that have happened, that proportion has remained pretty well the same. So it remains a problem for the Institute in terms of their education work to think, are they doing the right things? Should they be doing different things? And we really wanted to try and get to the bottom of what's going on. So another thing that I think is interesting to look at is this is the A-level subject choices for male and female. Sorry, no, female and male. So the most popular subjects for girls choosing A-levels, this was in 2012, but it's not dissimilar now, are English, psychology, biology. And physics is the 18th most popular subject. So of all the mainstream subjects, it's hard to imagine sort of 17 subjects that are more popular. The only one that is noticeably worse is ICT and computer studies, which are even more gendered than physics. For male students, the top subjects are maths, biology, physics, chemistry, followed by English and history. So the sciences and maths are right at the top in terms of popularity. So there's a very different pattern in terms of A-level choice for girls and boys. And this is another thing I think that is interesting. This is from UCAS data. This is degree course destinations for accepted applicants who had physics and A-level maths. And again, there are very different destinations for males and females, and I think that reflects different aspirations, different career ideas, different pathways. So for males, there's a lot of engineering here. So mechanical engineering, physics, civil engineering, electronic and electrical engineering, aerospace engineering, computer science, the top 6 things. Whereas for females, it's more diverse. So physics at the top, which is not unsurprising because these are students with maths and physics A-level, but then preclinical medicine. So that, I think, reflects the huge numbers of females going into medicine these days. It's now more than 50% of successful applicants are female. And these are doing some kind of medicine or medicine-related. And then it goes maths, chemistry, and there's only one of these top 6 choices that has engineering in its title. So it reminds, I think, teachers and people at university that although these students notionally have the same qualifications, they've got maths and physics A-level, they've got very different ideas about where they want to go with those subjects. And I think it's something that both schools and universities need to reflect on. So what has the Institute done in the past? In 2006, they developed some resources, and one of the things was called Girls in the Physics Classroom, which was a review of this current research around science and gender. That was done by 2 people from the Open University and is much quoted even now. And in addition to, in parallel to that, there was a teacher's guide with practical suggestions that teachers might use in the classroom. And on the back of that, we ran some action research projects with what was the DCSF in those days and the Science Learning Centres. So teachers who were interested in trying to affect change in their classroom. But the major thing that the Institute's been doing is trying to improve physics pedagogy in schools via something called the Stimulating Physics Network. I don't know whether you've come across that. So it's DFE funded and is ongoing and has been funded since 2008. And that's working with supporting teachers of physics in schools with a particular focus on supporting non-specialists, because so many schools have teachers of physics who are not specialists, who don't have a physics background. So the key influences on students' attitudes that came out of the research review were identified as this idea of self-concept, students' sense of themselves, who they were, and who they were in relation to the subject, and the value they place on it. So if they were going to continue, they had to see themselves in a good relationship with the subject and see where it fitted into their plans for their lives as they went forward. Obviously, perhaps views of physics, how they experience it at school, and that's to do with the sort of nuts and bolts of schooling, timetabling, lessons, the quality of the teaching they experienced. It's going to have an effect. And then this thing, particularly for girls, the student-teacher relationships, how personally supportive students find their physics teacher. And for girls, that seems to be a really critical thing. If they don't have that good feeling from a teacher, they're much more likely to give up, even if they're doing well. They need to feel that they're supported in this choice. So, to have a missing slide, a hidden slide, I think. Just really to say, so that we really were saying that school environment has a big choice on whether girls choose physics. Part of that is clearly to do with teaching quality and better teachers, and that's been a lot of the focus of the work. But some of it must be to do with the culture of the school, and anecdotally we knew that if you talk to many female physicists, they will have been to an all-girls school. That's by no means universally true, but very common. And so we wondered whether there's something different going on at mixed schools, at co-ed schools, compared to single-sex schools. And so It's Different for Girls was trying to look at this to see whether we could nail down that there was something different going on in different types of schools. So it used national pupil database data, so using unique pupil identification numbers and then tracking them through from GCSE to A-level. So it was looking at progression to A-level physics from different types of school, and that was the school where they did their GCSE. And we assumed that their experience in school pre-16 was pretty critical in whether they chose to continue with the subject post-16, and were there any patterns in the data. So we found that almost half of state-funded co-ed schools sent no girls on to actually to achieve A-level physics in 2011. So on this graph, we've got numbers of schools up the y-axis and numbers of girls and boys that went to take physics A-level across the x-axis. And there were 1,603 secondary schools that sent no girls on to do it, but went on to do A-level physics. And there were about 3,000 secondary schools in the country, so that's pretty well half of them. The National Pupil Database data is England. It doesn't include Scotland and Wales, but of those English schools. So the green columns are girls and the purple ones are boys. So many fewer schools sent no boys on. So that seemed pretty significant. If they were broken down into types of school, this was another way of looking at the data. So on the left-hand side, we've got independent schools, maintained state-funded schools on the right-hand side, and then co-ed, single-sex, co-ed, single-sex. And these are the percentages of girls and boys who went on to take physics A-level in 2011 by type of school. So not surprisingly, perhaps, there were more going on from independent schools overall. But if you look at the numbers of girls going on to take A-level physics, the proportions, 7.2% from single-sex independent schools, much, much higher than co-ed, single-sex, co-ed maintained schools. That's 1.8%. So big differences there. And even with single-sex maintained schools, it's nearly double in independent schools. So we think there was something about the culture of the co-ed school that's actually making gendered choices of subjects more likely. So the main findings there were this 49% of state-funded co-ed schools sent no girls on to take physics A-level in 2011. And for all secondary schools altogether, it's 46%, so that's including the single-sex schools, compared to only 14% for boys. And girls are almost 2.5 times more likely to go on to do A-level physics if they come from a girls' school rather than a co-ed school in the state-funded sector. So we decided, following on from that, that that report had a lot of publicity at the time, but we wanted to see whether it was a unique feature of physics or whether it applied to other subjects as well, and whether we could unpick the gendering of schooling that was going on in co-ed schools. So the next report, which was called Closing Doors, was focused on looking at a range of subjects and trying to see whether what we found for physics applied to other subjects, but it only focused on co-ed schools. So this is percentage female entry to A-level subjects in 2013, and it probably comes from this. There's an Ofsted handout here, which is numbers and proportions of girls and boys studying A-level subjects in England. So this is the A-level data disaggregated by gender. If I think, yeah. So physics is at the beginning here. So 21% of physics A-level students are female. Computing, only 7%. If you look at the very high ones, so this is performing expressive arts, 88% are female. Somology is down here. Sociology, art and design subjects, and psychology have very high proportions, 75% or so are female. So with this being the 50% line, there is it's surprising how many subjects are quite gendered. And I guess it's nothing new, but it was just sort of bringing a focus on that we thought was significant. Boys are more likely to choose facilitating subject, with the exception of languages. By that we mean the subjects that facilitate going on to a good university, as the Russell Group report, what it's called, but there is a report that talks about facilitating subjects. And we know that gender influence on choice of subjects is not necessarily correlated with ability or performance. I mean, broadly, girls do better than boys at GCSE in virtually every single subject, perhaps apart from maths, where I think they do about equally. So in terms of ability and performance, there's no reason why all of those subjects are not open to girls and to boys. So we wanted to look more closely at those limitations. So we decided to choose 6 subjects, which we hoped reflected something about the range of subjects that students do at A-level. So we chose physics and biology as 2 of the sciences. We chose maths and English because they are core subjects at school, and therefore you might expect them not to be gendered. And we chose economics and psychology, which are 2 subjects that most students only meet at A-level, and therefore, again, shouldn't necessarily have gendered expectations prior to that because they're coming to them new. So you would like to think that you'd probably get equal numbers being interested in them. But you'll be wrong. So it turns out that the red bit of these is the boys entering, and the orange bit are girls. So the midway should be there. That's 53%, because I think there are slightly more girls than boys doing A-levels anyway. But physics and economics are in the boys' subjects very thoroughly. Mathematics a bit less so. That's 40% girls, 60% boys. Biology, in fact, is the most even subject, although it's often thought of as a girl subject. Large numbers of boys do take it. But English and psychology are most definitely girls subjects, and 20–25% of the students only are boys. So something to think on, something for schools to think on. So what we then tried to do with the data, and in the report that goes with this, it explains this in more detail. We gave schools a score which was based on the proportion of boys or girls going on to do each individual subject. So they got a minus score if they were worse than the average on this previous slide, and they got a plus score if they were better than average, just in terms of boy-girl, male-female proportion. We then schools ended up with an overall score. So 49% of the schools had a score of -2 or below. These schools were kind of leveling out -1 to +1, and there were only 19% of the schools that had a score of +2 or above. So this is just in co-ed English schools, but very few of them were seemingly having a positive effect on gender parity in terms of choices and progression to A-level subjects. And this was one of the things that got slightly misquoted in the press at the time. But the main findings were out of that nearly 80% of state-funded co-ed schools were sustaining this gender imbalance or actually making it worse. And the fact that there were so many co-ed schools below average must mean that the single-sex schools are better at challenging these gender stereotypes and the sort of gendering of subjects. We also found there were very large regional differences. London and the East Midlands turned out to be the best and South West the worst, and we don't really know why that is. And it's worth pointing out that percentage of free school meals as a cipher for disadvantage has a major effect on overall numbers progressing to A-levels, and that's well known. But it didn't have on this gender balance. It seemed to be independent. This gender balance thing was independent of the proportion doing free school meals. So moving on to this most recent project that I'm talking about, we were aiming to identify barriers to and good practice in overcoming gender stereotypes. And the idea was to not use a data-driven report, but to try and do something a little bit more touchy-feely, which is we're always a bit nervous of in the Institute of Physics because it's not people's remit. But to see whether we could identify good practice in schools and see whether there was something about schools that were doing this kind of thing well. And we were offered funding by the Equalities Office, and we ended up with 2 networks of schools, and they ended up with 5 schools in each. One was around Bristol and Bath, and the other one sort of along the south coast. I have to say that we were aiming to have about 10 schools in each network, but despite having a full-time, well, no, a dedicated project officer, she didn't work full-time, but working very hard on this, recruiting the schools was really quite challenging, even though we didn't think we were asking all that much of them. But we did manage to persuade 5 schools in each area, so that was good. So the idea was that we would have meetings of the network 2 or 3 times over the course of the project, which ran over sort of 2.5 terms. So it started in the autumn of 2014 and went through into 2015. So the idea was for the schools to get to know each other, talk about the issues they found, good practice. And then the idea was that we were going to set up these visits where a school would be not inspected, but visited to see if we could identify good practice areas for concern and suggest ways that they might improve what we found. And the good practice guide, the Opening Doors report, came out of that. And the idea was to make it analogous to Project Juno, which is an IOP project focused on physics departments, and Athena Swan projects operating in universities. Are you familiar with that? So the difficulty, particularly I felt the difficulty was that the focus obviously in universities is on employees as well as students, but a significant number of it is employees of the university and people moving up the career ladder in university departments, whereas in schools it wasn't really about progression for teachers or the issue around teachers. It's actually focused on the teaching and learning environment from the point of view of the students. So kind of a different focus, but it did seem to work well. And actually, I have to say, worked much better than I thought it was going to. It's a colleague of mine who was very keen, and yeah, no, it's been very interesting. So in the network meetings, one of the things we did was review the results of an initial survey to establish an awareness of policies. So this was a SurveyMonkey survey, and we just asked as many teachers as possible in the schools to fill it in, and it was about, do you have an equality policy in the school? Do you know what's in it? Have you ever had any gender training? Things about careers and careers advice, things about setting and subject choice, that kind of thing. And I suppose, interestingly, the huge number of responses was don't know, which suggested that none of these things had ever been brought up in departmental or staff meetings within school. If it was being answered by somebody who was a member of senior leadership, then they were much more positive that, yes, they knew about all of this stuff. But it didn't seem as though that filtered down to the sort of bottom level in schools. And we also had some discussions on unconscious bias and gender stereotyping. So are you familiar with the concept of unconscious bias? Well, the idea that we all make quick decisions about people and situations that we need to do in order to function and make judgments and exist in complex environments, which on reflection may not be the best thing to be doing, so that you label people by the way they look, or the way they've done their hair, or what clothes they're wearing, and it may turn out that they're not at all like that when you get to know them. So it's been used very widely in workplace as a way of raising issues about fairness in interviewing, and trying to make people aware that the judgment you make on a person in the first 10 seconds as they walk through the door is not a good basis on which to make a judgment for future employment. And so once people are aware that they might be making these judgments, and again about students in school, they're like this because they wear their hair like that, or they're like the other because they walk in this particular way, or whatever. And particularly, obviously, there are aspects which are to do with other aspects of diversity, race, religion, that kind of thing. But in particular here, we're thinking of a focus on gender stereotyping and kind of assuming that girls are like this and boys are like that, and that's pretty fixed, and that can't be changed or challenged. And for some of the teachers, these were ideas that they had never explored before and were very new. So they were interested in understanding a little bit more about these things. In the site visits to each school, we had a panel, and each network visited each other's schools. So at least every teacher who came to the network meeting had the opportunity to go to at least one school, and some of them went to 2 other schools in their network. We had a gender expert from the Institute, and these were people who were experienced in going on Juno visits to university departments and had been involved in gender work. And a couple of staff from the Institute, so myself, a colleague, and our administrator would go. And after the visits, we had a confidential report on perceived issues, our recommendations, and good practice that we observed. And the good practice guide is based on these reports. So in the site visits, we tried to meet with various sections of the school community, so starting with meeting with senior leadership team and asking them on the sort of high level about policies and why they'd been involved with the project, what they wanted out of it. Meetings with teachers with special responsibilities, and they varied from school to school depending on what they thought were important teachers for us to meet. But we tried to see people from careers, pastoral support, PSHE, and so on. We had meetings with departmental heads, and then meetings with some, your classroom teachers who didn't have other hats as well, to see what it was like for them at the sort of bottom level of teaching in the school. We then had over lunch, we had meetings with groups of boys and groups of girls separately, so that we could ask them about their feelings about what went on in the school. We also had a walk around the school hosted by a student, and at the end of the day, we gave brief feedback to the senior leadership team. And I mean, I think broadly, those of you, I don't know how many of you are privileged to go into schools, but it's very interesting to see how different schools are. They have different, they obviously have physically different spaces and different buildings which they have to work with, but also the culture within the school, how you're welcomed, how you're walked around, the emphasis they place on different things really does vary from school to school. And that's so interesting and makes you aware that as a parent trying to choose things, it's very difficult to capture some of this less visible stuff. So I'm now going to go through some of the highlights of good practice that came out of the visit, and mention some of the sort of things that we particularly noted. So in terms of management, structure and environment, we noticed that significant changes and significant things had only happened in schools where a member of senior leadership team had taken it up and made it their mission, as it were, to prioritize gender issues and transmit that message strongly to staff and students. And that's really why we've talked about schools needing a gender champion, because unless it's coming from the top level, things are transient in schools, initiatives happen, they disappear, and if they depend on somebody who does not have much clout in the school, they will sink like a stone the minute that teacher disappears or no longer focuses on that. What was interesting also was that in many of the schools there was confusion about what equality of opportunity actually means. So many teachers talked about there not being a problem with gender issues because they treated every pupil as an individual. And they didn't seem to understand that treating pupil as an individual was fine, but you're coming with this whole set of preconceptions about the label male or female they come with, and what therefore your expectations are about how you interact with them, the things you think are appropriate to say to them, the advice you give to them, and so on. And for many teachers, it was the first time that they had been exposed to thinking that they're individuals and that's the end of it. They were very interested to discover that there was more to it than that. In terms of timetabling, we discovered, not surprisingly, schools don't always offer a free choice of options due to timetabling constraints. So this may be for GCSEs or going on to A-level. Subjects are usually offered in blocks, and these are usually constructed in a way that actually reinforces gender stereotypes. So you make up a block of subjects and you think, ooh, I'll put physics in this block, which will be, well, most of the boys will take this, but I'll probably have psychology in it as well. So you've then immediately polarized your students, and for those who want to blur the boundaries between their subject choices or may have slightly less stereotyped views, they're forced into a much more gendered choices than they might want to do. And also I think it reinforces the notion that there are girls and boys subjects, because it's just written into the way the timetable is organized. Walking around the schools, it was very interesting in terms of school environment. Lots of schools have got displays, either aspirational displays from famous people and phrases that they think will inspire their students. It's interesting that lots of new build schools have sort of quotations written on the walls, that they're from people like Mahatma Gandhi and so on. And I'm not sure whether, while they're inspirational, I'm not sure whether they kind of deal with all of the students, and they're very accessible to students. They make the teachers feel good as they walk past them. I'm not convinced they make the students feel good as they walk past them. But also, on a sort of a more school level, if often schools, I mean, I can think of a science department that had something about famous scientists outside it, but they were all male, and nobody seemed to have noticed that this was potentially problematic. Other schools had worked very hard on noticing, highlighting equal numbers of girls and boys, and if they'd focused on student work, it was much more likely that there were equal numbers. And there were, in one school, a PE department had particularly got photos of students on the walls and their achievements, but they were done alternate boy, girl, so it was very clear the messages that they were sending there about gender. And in schools where there were people who were more aware, then the display of work was more equally balanced between boys and girls. The other thing that is interesting is setting arrangements. So there were various arguments for setting in either direction, although generally I think settings now seem to be not such a good thing. But in schools where they're set right from the beginning, they are sending messages about gender and what girls and boys are good or bad at. And certainly in a school, not a school that was part of this project, we had an officer visiting an English lesson in which it was a top set English lesson, and about 80% of the top set were girls. And at the end of the lesson, she asked one of the boys, why do you think there were so few boys in this top set? And he said, well, boys are useless at English, aren't they? They're not so good as girls. Girls are always much better at English. And this was a Year 8 pupil. So it already learnt that, you know, English was not for boys. It gives boys permission to fail because clearly it's not for them. It's not a subject for them. So this seemed something that schools are unaware of, or even if they're aware of it, they don't quite know how to deal with it. And I think some schools are thinking perhaps about going back to trying some single-sex sets in order to address some of this. But it's an interesting thing to think about. And at the same token, often the bottom sets are largely male, and likely to be in the bottom sets something to do with behaviour, probably, rather than attainment. And the other thing that came up was classroom management in terms of behaviour management in particular. So because probably so few teachers had received explicit training on gender awareness, they seemed to be very unaware that that what they were doing in terms of management might have a impact. So lots of schools claim to have a seating arrangement where they were sat alternate girl, boy, and senior leadership would tell you confidently that was going on in the school. When you actually went around the classrooms, clearly that wasn't happening, and every teacher was allowing some relaxation of that. But it did seem to be very common that schools use putting a boy to sit between two girls as potentially a punishment, or certainly a behaviour management technique. The girls are very aware of this, and in many cases seemed, not surprisingly, deeply resentful, but didn't say anything. And I think that, again, that's really something to reflect on for schools, because it was very, very common, and it's, yeah. So in terms of policy and training, lots of staff had observed casual sexism in class, so students making sexist jokes, derogatory language. And many teachers are of course aware of the gender imbalance in their subjects, I mean, particularly in sciences and languages, but feel frustrated. They don't know what to do to make things better. but very few teachers have had any specific training either in their PGCE or later on gender issues. So they really don't know where to go, what they should be doing to try and make this better. One could see even through the conversations we had in terms of in the course of meetings, that some of them were beginning to reflect on what they did in class and wonder whether some of that could be altered to improve the sort of unwitting transmission of gender stereotyping that seemed to be happening. Lots of schools, of course, have diversity and inclusion policies somewhere on their websites, but whether teachers actually know what's in them and they're actually active within the school is very much another thing. There was one particular school that did have a code of behaviour displayed in every classroom, which talked about learning, attitude, respecting each other and respecting teachers and responsibility. And if that's paired with specific gender policy, then it was clear that there were very clear messages being sent out to the students. But that was unusual. Not all schools have that kind of thing. Going on to language and communications, all schools had policies in place to counter racist, homophobic and sexist language, but in probing, in conversation with the schools, in almost all, one felt that infringements in terms of racist or homophobic language would be dealt with very swiftly and significantly, but sexist language was a very grey area. Sometimes senior leadership would say, oh, there's not really a problem in our schools, but the classroom teachers would say, oh, yes, there is. And the students certainly felt that there was, almost universally, sort of year 10, year 11 students. That's going on. On a regular basis, it's excused by saying, oh, it's just a bit of banter. The boys, I think, were often very aware that it was inappropriate, but the kind of banter they had among themselves was different from when the girls were there. But examples, remarks being thrown across the classroom, it was clear that teachers weren't really sure where to draw a line and whether sending somebody up the chain of, for punishment was appropriate, whereas if it had been a racist remark or a homophobic remark, I think they would have been much more clear in their own minds as to whether that counted as a significant infringement. We feel that in good practice, teachers need to be trained in the use of, also in informal conversations with students. It's terribly easy to just reflect back your own prejudices, your own unconscious biases, your own views about the roles of men and women in society. And unless that's examined, you're just reproducing what's already there. And I mean, the whole premise on which this work is based is assuming that schools ought to be agents of change rather than just being reflecting society as it is found. So in terms of monitoring and support, we think that schools need to, lots of schools do collect data, but it seems as though often it's only talked about at senior leadership level, and that it doesn't filter down to classroom level teachers. So schools would say, oh, well, if there is a problem, we'd tell the teachers involved, but it didn't seem as though they were actively using the data in a way that was useful enough. And we would argue that across different subjects, if it appeared that progression had become excessively gendered either one way or the other, that ought to be a reason for reviewing the practice, how the subject's taught, what's going on in lessons, and whether there were changes that need to be made. pastoral support and PSHE. In lots of schools, there are very good and very dedicated teachers who offer pastoral support, but most of the time it's offered as a reactive thing on a one-to-one basis to students who are encountering problems in school or at home. But there's very little sort of broad brush view of where gender might come in that. And in schools where things were going particularly well, we felt they had PSHE programs that had dedicated and trained teachers who were producing a curriculum for teachers to use. It had high status, and it specifically dealt with gender issues ongoing as pupils progress through the school. So in terms of that, we felt that girls need to develop their confidence and resilience, and boys understand the link between hard work and high levels of achievement. This, I think, reflects back on something that's very strong in British schools, I think, which is this notion that of natural aptitude versus working hard to achieve, and we value this idea of natural aptitude, particularly in maths and the sciences, over and above hard work, so that, particularly noticed in the conversation with maths teachers, but this idea that there are some naturally brilliant people who you would rather do A-level or progress on, and they are often boys and they often do very little work, compared to, oh, I've got these girls, they're doing really well, but they work so hard, I don't know whether they'll manage when they go on. And that was more common than you would like. And I think it's a view we really need to challenge. Hard work, people get better by practicing and doing hard work. Hard work results in people being better at things and achieving. So penalising the girls for working hard is a very hard way of discriminating against them, but I do think it happens. And similarly for boys, the whole notion of addressing underachievement of boys, if it can be framed as a gender issue and a cultural issue, then it's not about persuading individual boys that they need to work a bit harder, but understanding that we need to change the culture around this, and that just as they might practice hard to get their football skills better, they practice hard at their English, they'll get better at that. It's no different. So several of the schools had initiatives that were trying to do things, and again, I think we feel that schools are flooded with initiatives. Unless they have a champion at senior management level, they die quickly. They need to have they need to be shared across the school. They need to be properly evaluated. So we came across examples of things of choosing English texts that might appeal to boys, analysing gender representation as part of media studies, and specific visits to things outside to encourage more girls into mathematics. While these schemes are admirable, they're usually driven by one or two members of staff that are enthusiastic, and unless they can be made more general, they stick with one member of staff. I've mentioned underachievement of boys, so I will move on because I realise I've been talking rather too long. One of the things that came up about this is that, particularly for maths and for physics, I suppose, very often students are discouraged from taking them unless they're going to do exceptionally well. The modal grade for A-level physics is actually an A, so it suggests that students who could get grades B's or C's are still okay grades to get, but they're being actively discouraged from taking those subjects because they mightn't do very well. And in some schools, the requirements to progress to A-level in particularly maths and physics, but in other sciences, are sometimes higher than they are for other subjects. And teachers would argue that that represents a reality for their subject, but it's also transmitting, continuing on a myth about it being harder and I think higher risk for girls, and therefore you're much more likely to advise girls not to go for high risk strategies. I think both staff and parents generally are more risk adverse for their daughters than they are for their sons. So things that might be too hard you think of as hard or challenging for your daughter, you would tend to advise them to avoid, whereas you might not do the same if it was for a son. So we think there's some work to do around that, certainly. And I mentioned the hard work versus innate ability thing. What's interesting is in schools that have large ethnic minorities with immigrants, that's usually very different because immigrant communities have a very different approach usually to this, and they are firm believers in hard work and achievement. But if you're in a school in a rural area with very little new blood coming into the community, some of these views are very entrenched and much harder to shift. One of the things that students raised actually was accessibility for sports. I suppose we haven't thought of it as being an issue, but lots of the students girls felt strongly that they didn't always have access to things like football. And if there weren't leagues for them to play in, they minded about that. Some of the schools had, one school had mixed teams competing in things outside of the curriculum, so at lunchtimes and so on, volleyball and football penalty shootouts and various things like that. They didn't necessarily have to have single-sex teams, and those mixed sessions seem to work really well, and the boys and the girls really like them. Really. So in terms of careers advice in schools is patchy, not always very good, and very often it's responsive again. So if individual says, oh, I think I might want to become an architect, can I have an appointment with the careers advisor? They go off and they have a little chat and they're told what they need to do. But that doesn't deal with broader issues about opening opportunities or narrowing choices, and there doesn't seem to be very much scope in many schools for that kind of more general discussion. We also think that schools need to make better use of local data and national data in terms of, average salaries for jobs. Nobody ever mentions money, but traditional women's jobs in the caring professions are significantly paid less than other jobs, but I'm sure most girls don't seem to know this, and I think it's worth pointing out to students that while a salary of, I don't know, 20,000 might seem an awful lot of money when you're age 15 and you're looking upwards, when you get to being 40 and you're supporting a family and so on, you might think that very differently, but that doesn't ever seem to be talked about in schools, and I think that's really important. Also, in best practice, parents need to be engaged in an early stage and their stereotypical views challenged. And that's quite a hard thing to do, but seems to be really important if you want change to happen. Schools where good things were going on, students were made heart of the campaign. So in one school in particular that had a very significant project about approaching homophobia. It's a school with a large immigrant population, mostly from Somalia, and there was a concern that I think there'd been a lot of homophobic comments around in the school. They used the support of Stonewall and actually had Ian McKellen came and talked to the school and was very, very inspiring. And they then had set up staff and students together, a supporting group, and both staff and several students had come out as a result of that and were being actively supported in doing that, and some of the students that the group had been able to liaise with parents to effect a smooth understanding of what was going on. So we felt that in that school it was very easy to extend what they already had in place to addressing more broader issues of gender. And groups generally work best with students. I'm hurrying to the end here. So in terms of what the Institute wants to do next, the report was launched at a conference in which we had speakers from a variety of backgrounds. We had a psychologist, somebody, a sociologist as well. So we're trying to be friendly to the ologists. But whether it was a worthwhile thing to do to try and establish a conference series where some of these issues could be talked about across a range of subjects and with a range of inputs. And to consider whether we would have some kind of award scheme, a bit like Athena Swan or Juno, where schools could get some kind of benchmark award. And I think that's still in discussion because it's not clear quite how that would work and who would run it and whether it would continue to be valued and so on. But that's where we've got to. So thank you very much. I've come to the end of what I wanted to say, and I think I've probably said rather too much. But
thanks. You haven't said too much at all. That felt like a really fantastically wide-ranging talk, starting with a very clear focus of how to get girls to physics, but covering a lot of the deeper and wider gender issues that some of us grapple with a lot and others are very interested in too. So thanks. So now I suggest that people take a comfort break. And okay, well let's make a start on the second part of the event. So it's really open to everybody for questions, comments, and I'll share this. So just indicate, okay, to either people three. So okay, so I think that was Brett, Colin, Carolyn, Gemma that I spotted in that order. So Brett.
Okay. I have two questions, so I'll ask the second one if the other people run out. So the first one is really about the role of percentages and ratios in these kind of analyses. Because it seems to me that what you're actually interested in, quite rightly so, don't have a problem with it intrinsically, is the numbers of women entering physics. Yet what you always seem to be actually displaying on more often than not on the slides, is a percentage of women in comparison to men, as it were. And now my problem with this is that you could have a situation where things like overall numbers of people entering physics changing would play havoc with that kind of analysis. So I can imagine a situation where you might have, if you were to have a mechanism for increasing the number of women entering physics, but at the same time men were also increasing and they happen to increase slightly greater, then actually you'd seem to be in a negative situation because the percentage would be slightly less.
Well, that's actually the case at the moment, I think.
And I wonder whether that would actually be a problem. I mean, so long as you're getting absolute numbers of women increasing, then what is the percentage, what is the role of that percentage, I suppose, is the question. I mean, you could equally argue then, well, if you just reduced the number of men entering physics and kept women constant, you've probably got a positive situation. So for me, your benchmark should be perhaps number of women entering physics in year 2000, and then have a number that's 50, then you have 51 is more and 49 is less, and you would measure it in that kind of way. So I wonder what it is about the percentage and comparison with males entering physics that interests you so much. Why is it that rather than just simply absolute numbers of women?
Well, I think it comes back to this whole gendered society thing, and knowing from the experiences, because the Institute of Physics, I suppose, originally is an institute representing members who are practicing physicists or have a physics background. So normally the requirement to be a member is that you have a degree in physics or a largely physics subject. So representing its members, it started looking particularly at universities, and it's clear in university departments, particularly, we hope it's significantly changed, but that the women had a pretty poor experience and experienced active discrimination as they tried to endure remaining within a department or progressing through it. So I think we see it as a social justice issue in terms of if you are in a profession or a thing where there is a strong gender imbalance, the minority is always going to have difficulty, have struggle. So we certainly had conversations about whether, is it a good thing to have 50-50 entries for all subjects? Is that the ultimate goal, so that if you looked at A-level entries, they would be equal numbers of girls and boys for every subject? And I'm not sure we know what the answer is, but certainly it would seem that approaching a more closer to the mean would be a more healthy situation. So I think that's...
I'm kind of struggling to know where to start, really, because there's so many different things I've been interested in for a while that you were covering. I think one observation and then a question. I did note your observation that it seems to be a lot easier for schools to tolerate sexist language rather than racist language, homophobic language, and so on. And I was tempted to open my remarks by saying I'm making a comment from what is obviously the boys' end of the table here. And then I thought, well, if we happen to be the only 3 white people in the room, it would never occur to make a comment about coming from the white end of the table. Or it might occur to me, but I certainly wouldn't say. And that, I think is very important, and in some way reflects the kind of natural, the way in which these things are seen as being natural. I think my question is more to do with your view about cause and effect relationships. If you go all the way back to the classic Rosenthal and Jason study, late 1960s, about the impact of teachers' expectations upon what students do, the relationship between the two has always been very clear. What teachers expect seems to be what happens. That, of course, could be simply because what happens is what teachers end up expecting. So it's the nature of the causal relationship between the two. What you've largely presented, I think, is some interesting correlational bits of data about the relationship between patterns of attainment, subject choice in schools, and what the schools do. I'm not sure if you've said anything, but you may have something to say, which is the question, about whether what the schools do actually make a difference, or whether schools are simply reflecting the demands of the people who come there. And that's most likely to be apparent, I would have thought, in the difference between independent and state schools, because independent schooling is obviously a choice. It's a choice that's only available to some people. So they're very particular, both in the fact that they want to make the choice and that they have the resources to support it. So are those schools simply reflecting the different intakes that they have? Is that also true within the differences you note between schools within the state sector? So I was thinking as well about the regional differences that you touched on. And another question was whether how ethnicity interacts with gender, because you said, I think, London and East Midlands particularly good in terms of avoiding the worst kind of gender differences. South West England particularly bad. And then you went on later to say that the South West of England is possible. I think I heard you say, you might not have said it, that the South West England is one of the places where you probably find relatively little in the way of ethnic mix. Certainly you do in London, certainly you do in the East Midlands. The lazy stereotype of some ethnic groups is that they are more likely to be gendered because of various other aspects of the culture. But I think you touched on some important observations about the way that doesn't work when you get this complicated interaction with the perceived role of ability and hard work in what people choose to do. So I think the question is, sorry about that, I think the question is, do you think schools can actually make a difference? Is there any evidence in what you've seen that shows that things change as a result of schools making the initiatives rather than schools making the initiatives as a result of things changing around?
I think, to be honest, we don't have any evidence that schools make a difference. Although we had initially wanted to recruit schools that had a different score on our closing doors, we weren't able to recruit enough schools to these networks, nor spread them out to make any attempt to see whether they were better or worse. So that aspect of it sort of largely disappeared. But I guess we're just being woolly liberals then in assuming that or hoping that good practice would be reflected in good attainment and progression data for that school. But I think that's the truth of it.
What kind of things would want to pick up on? But Caroline, you were there.
Thank you. I enjoyed that, but found it also quite depressing. And I mean, it seems to me that you could have come and done that seminar pretty much exactly as you did it in the 80s, and said the same things. And because those kind of findings were emerging in the 80s, and since then there's been lots of initiatives, lots of kind of guidance, probably in similar kind of style to what you present here, and yet the situation is similar. And I think from your first slide, it's presented down a little bit. Okay. So my question really is, what do you think will happen to this? And you mentioned that there might be something like the Athena Swan Awards school, because it strikes me that there's been lots and lots of initiatives and research like this, and yet we're still in this same position. So I wonder if you could say a bit about what you hope will happen and what you think needs to happen in order for the situation to shift.
So I guess one of the things that's changed since then is that we've got better data and better access to data. So with the National Pupil Database being available to researchers, it is a very rich resource, and we were aware that we were only scratching a little bit on the surface. There is lots of stuff to be gleaned from that, and I think we've reached a stage where it's not unreasonable to expect schools to use the data that's available on the school level. So if you go on the Ofsted website and look at Ofsted data for schools, at the moment it does it by different subjects, and you see a school compared to similar schools with a similar profile, but none of that's disaggregated by gender. And we think it should be, so that if there are clear disparities there, that's something that we think schools ought to be dealing with. And I think we would argue that a school shouldn't get outstanding in its Ofsted inspection unless if there were gender issues apparent in its data. So I suppose that's maths, English and science particularly.
It would be about external monitoring.
Yes. But I mean, I presume that Ofsted do the managing the data themselves. They put up that data. I don't know who actually crunches the numbers, whether it's Ofsted themselves or somebody in a MPD team. But they've got it by gender. All they've got to do is. No. It's interesting. But I think also, for me, the thing that's different from the 80s is that I would like the conversation to be about gender parity and about equality of opportunity for all, and about keeping your options open. And the issue of white working class boys, particularly perhaps in rural environments, who may see their choices as incredibly limited. It's about offering them the right kind of support to see that there are genuine opportunities for them as well as for women and girls. And I think that's a different rhetoric about it. And it's not hardline feminism. I'd like it to be something a bit different.
I had a question.
mainly because I was one of those girls who was pushed into physics by incentives such as these. Not although I didn't get about it, I guess as I matured, in learning about physics, it means that perhaps I don't think physics is so pure. And I take Rick's point about the steps, perhaps the numbers that you give here are perhaps blurring the lines a bit about what I'm going to ask. Why is it important that women take physics, girls take physics? Like, why how does it benefit?
Okay, so I suppose.
Quality of opportunity, that's fine, but I see. Let me just stare at it because I see a lot of things here about their parity or girls taking more than boys into biological sciences. I don't know why the sole looking at physics as your really perhaps you should be thinking about physics as more, and a lot of professors agree with me, a pure subject that can be applied.
I think that's a very good point, but as an ex-employee of the Institute of Physics, the key is in the title.
But I think if you put it in a bit more to add maybe complex shape of brain physics and other subjects, perhaps it wouldn't be so selective school that you're thinking. I mean, I know that in 10 I took the special physics and then I went to physics in the university, but then, the direction I took that physics knowledge with me. That physics knowledge gave me underneath the choices that I made. Yeah. Very gendered, clinical medical science, etc. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I should consider the given.
Oh no, I don't think that's the intention at all. The intention is that people should have a good enough experience of physics that they're able to make an informed choice at the choice points in their education and career. So if the experience has been so poor at school that you don't really know what the subject is or what it can offer, then you're cutting off choices. I mean, not just in physics, but in other subjects as well. So that's to do with the quality of teaching. But I suppose broadly it ties in with the notion that the expansion in the labour market in the future is in STEM-related areas, and there are lots of companies in those areas that want people with STEM qualifications. And one way to do this is, well, you need to persuade more people then that doing A-levels and then degrees or vocational courses in those subjects is useful. It leads to engaging, well-paid, interesting work that will last your lifetime. And it's easier, the version is, to persuade some well-qualified girls to choose that path than to scrape lower down the more general barrel of people who are perhaps less able or less interested and persuading them.
Jo.
Really nice. Thank you. Lots of questions, but I'll limit time short. One, I wondered how the UK or England compared with other European countries in terms of the disparities. And secondly, I just thought, well, you've got to start somewhere, but the potential for widespread intervention. I'm thinking back to the research that I did, and Corinne has gone on to do less gendered subjects, not physics, gone into engineering. But further down the line, found that the industry continues to be so gendered, found it impossible, which is quite depressing.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, certainly I think that's true, and I think some people feel that there's an issue with encouraging girls to take subjects where they might have a bad time later on in terms of pursuing a career. And I mean, yes, that's a genuine concern, but it's about perceiving a risk, I think, and levels of risk, and with risk comes opportunity. And we only live our lives once, and if you're going to make it completely safe, nobody will do anything, and so on. So I think that's a useful area to explore. And I certainly think both from a parent and teacher point of view, it's something to think about. And I think thinking about it in risk terms, I find a very helpful way of thinking about it. You asked something before about compared. Well, interestingly, as you go further south in Europe, the proportion of women in physics gets higher. So in Italy and Portugal and Spain, the proportion is higher. But as far as we understand it, we think it's because the status of university physics is subtly different in these countries. And so, for example, in Italy, engineering is much higher status than physics. And so men tend to go into engineering and the women go into physics. And I think also something about the status and pay of university compared to companies. So it is subtly mediated by society in the different countries. And I suppose, you could argue that the choices people make is very finely tuned to perceived opportunities in adult life.
Okay, there's probably time for probably one or two more questions. Dawn, I also just wanted to, see if you've got a question there. No need to have one if you have one, because there's plenty of other people. I just wanted to show you that I haven't forgotten you. So, who put their hands up just now? Kirsty's got her hand up. Oh, God, there's loads.
Well, I'll sit this one out, and I'll keep this one. Mine was just about the gender of teachers and their own reflections on their own experiences. I'm never taught and not teaching, but I've got lots of friends who teach. It surprises me what you say about them being really awakened to this idea that there could be sort of a gendering of the curriculum or of classroom management, because all my friends, particularly music teachers, sports teachers, are so acutely aware of it. I find that really surprising.
Perhaps if they're music or sport, they're particularly aware because it's very obvious. I think in academic subjects, strangely, it seems
a lot of them teach sport and other things like their science, they've done science degrees and it gets deployed into sport A-level and things like that. So they do have science backgrounds. Or I don't know. I still find it really, really interesting that from your own experiences, even the same kind of.
It is surprising. I don't know whether it's changing recently and whether it's perhaps the 40-year-olds for whom they've had very little exposure to this, but people who are coming into teaching now are more aware because it's been out in the media much more. I don't know.
I'm going to be cheeky and try and ask a question and a half. So the full question is, I noticed one of your early slides, it's quite a striking slide, it showed the difference between physics entry, male and female, in independent and state schools, and that the female entry was much higher in independent schools than in state schools, and also the single sex, it was higher again. But also, I think embedded in that slide, we could see the same phenomenon for male students at a slightly lower level. So it seems that in the independent schools, it didn't make much difference for the boys whether they were in a gender school or a co-ed school. But in the state school, it does seem to be that the two factors are interacting with each other. And I just wondered if there's a social class difference manifesting here.
We don't really know, but clearly there seems to be something around the culture of independent schools, which is you can do anything, and that seems to make gender is mediated.
The thing about the independent schools for the boys, it doesn't matter whether they're co-ed or not, whereas in the state schools it does seem to matter for the boys as well as for the girls. So the boys bar on that chart was higher, not as enormously higher as the girls' chart, but it was higher. It's that one thing, yes. So you see that on the right, the boys have gone up dramatically as well, whereas on the left, you don't see too much difference between that.
I think the argument, we've had some conversations around this, because this was schools where students sat their GCSEs, so some of the schools will be 11 to 16 schools, And we know that there's poorer progression generally to A-level from 11 to 16 schools than if you have a school that includes a sixth form. And the single-sex schools include places that still have grammar schools, and therefore you would expect greater progression there. So I don't think there are any 11 to 16 schools that have grammar school entry by attainment. That combination doesn't exist. So I think it's probably masking those differences in different types of school.
So my other half question was just a comment about, you mentioned that school students are perhaps not so aware of economic rewards. And it's a good job and a bad job, but in fact, among our biology students, we see a substantial proportion that failed medical school entrance that are coming round again for another go at the fence. And a lot of them, I tire of the ones that profess to want to be doctors and have no interest in medicine. No, well, it's not. It's just, it's not even that. It's that
they want to be doctors because they see it as well paid.
Well, they're well aware of the fact that the Vice Chancellor isn't the most highly paid person on campus. So, yeah. But I just find that depressing. So I thought I would share it with everybody.
Yes, but I mean, I do think at the school level there's very little conversation with school students about, you know, what counts as a comfortable income, what the average income means in terms of what you can get for it. And that some work has shown that actually boys are better at understanding what that is. If you say a salary of 20,000, what you can get for that, and girls are less good at that. So I certainly think there's more work to be done, and you know, one needs to be straight up about this. And
that kind of straight up language jars with the aspirational language that schools are encouraged, you know, about raising aspiration, you know, limitless opportunities, imagining yourself doing anything. And I think
yes, and also with this thing of you know, seeing everyone as an individual, and you do what you're interested in. So the girl who's professed an interest in childcare, which is a very common thing in early teenage years, you know, a huge number of girls say that that's something they're interested in pursuing, but pointing out that A, their interests may change, but also those kind of jobs very often, unless they are graduate jobs, will be low paid and stay low paid. So however much you value a childminder or a nursery assistant, you're not going to be earning, you won't have a significant career progression. It is worth pointing out.
Okay, well, it'd be nice to end on a cheerful note, but I don't quite know what that is. But thanks very, very much. The cheerful note is that was a wonderful talk, and thanks very much indeed.
Yeah, thank you very much. I've really enjoyed being here. It's been really great.
Oh, and yes, thanks. Dee's just reminded me that I need to tell you about the next department seminar, 3rd of February, and that's Catherine Brunswick-Cole, who is a Senior Research Fellow in Disability Studies and Psychology at the Research Institute for Health and Social School at Manchester, 3rd of February. And her title is, Do We Need Disabled Children's Childhood Studies?